Marriage is a curious thing. It starts with two people standing before their loved ones, making grand promises to stick it out through every storm. That's how it was for me and Tessa. For 4.5 years, I thought we were weathering life's storms together. Our marriage a ship that would stay afloat no matter what. But there I was, sitting across from her in our kitchen, blindsided by the storm I never saw coming. Tessa's words sliced through me like a knife. "I think we need a break, Liam." She said it so casually, as if she were asking me to pass the salt. The air in the room felt different, thick with tension and laced with the bitterness of betrayal. "A break?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. I was gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I need time to figure things out with Dylan." Dylan, the ex. The one who always seemed to hover in the background of our relationship like an unwanted ghost. I'd been a fool to think he was just a harmless relic of her past. I wanted to yell, to demand how she could even think of something so outrageous. But I didn't. My pride refused to let her see the cracks forming inside me. Instead, I nodded and forced out, "Okay." Tessa looked surprised, maybe even relieved, as if she'd expected me to fall apart right then and there. But falling apart wasn't an option. No, I would give her the calm she thought she wanted. I'd save my breakdown for when I was alone. The rest of that evening was a blur. Tessa talked about needing clarity, about figuring things out. I listened but didn't truly hear her. My thoughts were elsewhere, spinning, calculating, plotting. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her upend my life. If she thought she could waltz back in after her break, she was sorely mistaken. Later that night, I sat in the darkened living room, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at our wedding photo. Tessa's smile beamed back at me, full of promise and love. It felt like a cruel joke now. I wanted to smash the frame, to obliterate the memories it held. But I didn't. I simply set it down and made a decision. I wasn't going to let her see me crumble. I wasn't going to let her, or Dylan, think they'd won. I'd let her take her break, but on my terms. This wasn't just about salvaging my pride. It was about taking back control of a situation that had spiraled out of my hands. The next morning, I kissed her on the cheek as she packed her things. "Take all the time you need," I said, my voice even. Her wide-eyed surprise almost made me laugh. She thought she held the power in this situation. She had no idea what I had planned. As I watched her drive away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for what we'd lost, anger at her audacity, and oddly, a glimmer of determination. I wasn't the same man I'd been when we said, "I do." And if Tessa wanted to see what life without me looked like, well, I'd be more than happy to oblige. By the time the sun set that evening, I had a notebook in hand, scribbling down ideas for my next steps. If Tessa thought she could put our life on pause while she explored her feelings for someone else, she had another thing coming. This was my breaking point, yes, but not in the way she expected. This wasn't going to break me. It was going to redefine me. The house felt emptier without Tessa, but not in the way I'd expected. I thought the silence would crush me, that I'd find myself wandering through the rooms like a ghost, lost in the memories of our life together. Instead, the quiet brought clarity. It wasn't long before Noah showed up, my best friend since college. He had an uncanny ability to sense when things were wrong. When I opened the door, his raised eyebrow and casual, "So, what's the deal?" told me he already knew this wasn't a social visit. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain the mess my life had become. Finally, I blurted out, "Tessa's taking a break, to figure things out with Dylan." Noah's jaw tightened, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with something more protective. "She what?" I waved him inside, collapsing onto the couch as he followed. "She says she needs space to figure out if she still has feelings for her ex." The words tasted bitter as I said them aloud. Noah didn't mince words. "That's garbage, Liam. You know that, right? She's testing how much she can get away with." He wasn't wrong, but hearing it out loud stung. I nodded, staring at the half-empty glass of water on the coffee table, Tessa's glass. I didn't want to fight her. I just let her go. "And now?" he asked, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Now, I take my life back," I said, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. Noah smirked, a spark of approval in his eyes. That's more like it. You can't sit around waiting for her to decide whether you're worth it. You're better than that. The conversation shifted after that. Noah didn't let me wallow. He reminded me of who I was before Tessa, back when I had dreams and ambitions that weren't tied to anyone else. By the time he left, I felt lighter, like some of the weight I'd been carrying had been lifted. The days that followed were a blur of activity. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office to avoid coming home to the emptiness. But it wasn't just work that kept me busy. I started making changes, small ones at first, like rearranging the furniture and clearing out the kitchen cabinets. Each action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I also took Noah's advice and focused on my own well-being. I dusted off my old running shoes and hit the trails again, rediscovering the joy of pushing my body to its limits. There was something therapeutic about the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the ground, the burn in my lungs, and the rush of endorphins that followed. Still, there were moments when the reality of the situation hit me hard. When I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text Tessa or glance at the empty side of the bed and feel a pang of loneliness. But those moments were becoming less frequent. One evening, as I sat in the backyard with a beer in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something important. Tessa's decision, as painful as it was, might have been a blessing in disguise. For years, I'd been so focused on making her happy, on being the husband she needed, that I'd lost sight of myself. I'd ignored the subtle ways she took more than she gave, the imbalance in our relationship that I'd been too blind, or too hopeful, to see. This wasn't just a break from her. It was a break from the version of myself that had settled for less than I deserved. I started setting goals for myself, writing them down in the same notebook where I'd been tracking my thoughts since Tessa left. It felt good to have something to work toward, to envision a future that didn't revolve around her. By the end of the week, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Tessa's betrayal might have shaken me, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had forced me to rediscover my own strength, to remember who I was before her. And for that, I was oddly grateful. The day after I realized I'd been living in Tessa's shadow for far too long, I made a decision. It was time to take back control. She'd walked out to figure things out. So why should I keep holding up the pieces of a life she so easily abandoned? The first thing I did was tackle our joint commitments. Canceling our vacation plans felt cathartic, if not a little symbolic. The couple's getaway to the Caribbean we'd been planning for months? Gone. I called the airline, canceled the tickets, and made sure the refund went straight to my account. There was no sense in wasting money on a dream that had already fallen apart. Next were our finances. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, opening the accounts we'd shared. Tessa might have walked away from our life, but she wasn't going to drag me down financially. I separated our funds, transferring my share into a new account she didn't have access to. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protection. As I sorted through everything, I couldn't help but notice just how many sacrifices I'd made for her over the years. The trips I skipped to save for things she wanted, the nights out with friends I gave up to accommodate her plans, the dreams I put on hold because they didn't align with hers. The realization stung, but it also fueled me. After securing the finances, I turned my attention to our home. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, filled with memories I wasn't ready to confront. So, I started boxing up her things. Her clothes were the first to go. I pulled every blouse, dress, and pair of shoes from the closet, neatly folding them into boxes. Next came her books, her skincare products cluttering the bathroom counter, the framed photos she'd insisted on displaying in every room. Each item I packed felt like peeling away another layer of our marriage. I wasn't angry as I worked, at least, not outwardly. My movements were deliberate, almost mechanical. But inside, there was a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. Not just at Tessa, but at myself. How had I let things get so one-sided? How had I not seen the cracks in our foundation until it was too late? Once everything was packed, I called a courier service and had her belongings delivered to her mother's house. I didn't include a note. What was there to say? She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. The final step was consulting a lawyer. It felt strange, sitting in a sterile office discussing the end of a marriage I hadn't even realized was in jeopardy. But as the lawyer explained my options, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time, I had a roadmap for moving forward. As I left the lawyer's office, I couldn't help but reflect on how much clearer things had become in Tessa's absence. Without her constant presence, I could finally see the flaws in our relationship, the ways I'd bent over backward to accommodate her needs while neglecting my own. That evening, I sat in the now-bare living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. The house felt hollow, but in a way, it matched how I felt. It was as if I'd been living in a storybook version of our marriage, oblivious to the cracks forming beneath the surface. For years, I'd convinced myself that our love was enough to overcome anything. But now, with the clarity that comes from distance, I saw the truth. Love wasn't the problem. It was the lack of respect, the imbalance of effort, the unspoken resentments that had quietly eroded the foundation of our relationship. Unraveling the life we built together was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. By the time I went to bed that night, I'd made peace with the fact that our marriage was beyond repair. Tessa might have walked away first, but I was the one closing the door for good. And strangely, that realization didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. It felt like freedom. They say a house is just a building, but a home? A home is where memories live. For years, this place had been my home. Our home. It had seen the best of us, the laughter and late-night talks, and now it was nothing but an empty shell. When Tessa walked out, she left behind more than just her things. She left behind an echo of what once was, and I couldn't live in it any longer. The house, once a symbol of our union, now felt like a mausoleum of broken promises. I decided to sell it. The process started with a call to a real estate agent. Her chipper voice on the other end of the line felt at odds with the weight of what I was about to do, but I pushed through. "I'm looking to sell my house," I said, my tone flat but firm. "Wonderful. I can help with that. Can we set up a time for a walkthrough?" "Sure. The sooner, the better." The next day, she arrived, clipboard in hand and a smile plastered across her face. "This is a lovely home," she said as we walked through the rooms. I bit back a bitter laugh. Lovely wasn't the word I'd use. I explained my situation in vague terms, just enough for her to understand I wanted the house gone quickly. She nodded, scribbling notes as she inspected the property. "We can get this listed within the week," she said brightly. Listing the house was easy. The hard part was letting go of the memories it held. The wall where we'd measured each other's heights, the kitchen where we'd danced on lazy Sunday mornings, the garden we'd planted together. It all felt tainted now. But I wasn't just doing this for me. Selling the house meant there was no safety net for Tessa to come back to. If she thought she could waltz back into my life, she'd find an empty lot where our life together used to stand. Packing up the last of her belongings was a final act of closure. I filled box after box, each one a reminder of the life we'd built and the life I was now dismantling. Her favorite throw blanket, the mug she always used for her morning coffee, the books she'd stacked on the bedside table but never read, they all went into the pile. I loaded everything into my car and drove to her mother's house. The old woman opened the door, her eyes narrowing as she saw me standing there with the boxes. "Liam," she said, her voice cautious. "These are Tessa's things," I said simply, setting them on the porch. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I wasn't in the mood for a conversation. "Tell her I wish her well," I added, though we both knew it was a lie. Driving away from that house felt like shedding a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Back at home, I took the final step, staging the house for prospective buyers. The real estate agent advised removing anything personal, so I stripped it of anything that held meaning. By the time I was done, it looked like a catalog showroom, perfect but soulless. As the first potential buyers walked through, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This wasn't my home anymore. It was just a property, a piece of real estate waiting to be handed off to someone else. When Tessa called a few days later, I ignored the first few rings. Finally, I picked up, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. "I drove by the house," she said without preamble. It's listed for sale? Yes, I replied evenly. Liam, you can't just… I can, I interrupted. You walked away, Tessa. I'm just making sure there's nothing for you to come back to. There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought I heard her voice crack. I didn't think you'd take it this far, she finally said. I didn't think you'd leave me to figure out your feelings for another man. I shot back, my voice steady but cold. She didn't respond, and I ended the call without waiting for her to. The house, like our marriage, was no longer something I wanted to hold on to. It was time to move on, and selling it felt like a clean break, a way to start fresh without the weight of the past hanging over me. As I stood in the empty living room that evening, the echoes of our life together faded into silence. This house wasn't our home anymore. It was just a building, and I was ready to let it go. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And as I locked the door behind me, I knew I was finally taking the first step toward a future where Tessa was nothing more than a memory. It didn't take long for Tessa to come crawling back, or at least, that's what it felt like. 2 weeks after I listed the house for sale, my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether I even wanted to hear what she had to say. Curiosity won out. Hey, Liam, she began, her tone hesitant, almost too casual. Tessa, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I was hoping we could meet, just to talk. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang in the air. I could tell by her voice that she wasn't as confident as she wanted to sound. What's there to talk about? I asked. Please, Liam. Just, let's talk, she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I agreed to meet her, though I made sure the location wasn't anywhere near our house. If she thought she was walking back into that space, she was in for a rude awakening. We settled on a coffee shop downtown, one that held no sentimental value to either of us. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table and nervously stirring her drink. She looked up as I approached, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Thanks for coming, she said as I sat down. I nodded, keeping my expression unreadable. What's on your mind? She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. I've had some time to think, and I realized I made a mistake. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her continue. I thought I needed closure with Dylan, but it was a disaster, she admitted, her voice cracking. He's not the person I thought he was, and… Let me stop you right there, I interjected, my tone firm but calm. This isn't about Dylan. This is about you. You made a choice, Tessa. You can't just walk away from our marriage, explore your feelings for someone else, and then expect everything to go back to the way it was. She blinked, as if my words had physically struck her. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Liam. I got confused. Confused, I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. You weren't confused when you packed your bags and left. You weren't confused when you told me you needed space to figure out your feelings for another man. Her eyes dropped to the table, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. I thought you'd understand, she whispered. I let out a bitter laugh. Understand? Tessa, do you even realize what you're asking? You didn't want a break. You wanted a safety net. You wanted the freedom to explore your options while keeping me as your backup plan. Her head snapped up, and I saw the flash of guilt in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. I leaned forward, my voice steady but laced with finality. I'm not your safety net, Tessa. You made your choice and I've made mine. The house is for sale. Your things are at your mom's, and I'm moving on. Her eyes widened in shock. The house? You're really selling it? I nodded. Yes. It's listed, and I've already had a few showings. There's nothing left for you to come back to, Tessa. This marriage is over. She looked like I just punched her in the stomach. Liam, please. We can fix this. I can fix this. Just give me a chance. I shook my head, my expression resolute. No, Tessa. I gave you everything I had, and it wasn't enough for you. I'm done being your fallback plan. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things neither of us could say. Finally, she stood, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. I didn't think you'd take it this far, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood as well, meeting her gaze with a calm that surprised even me. And I didn't think you'd walk away from our marriage. But here we are. She left without another word, and as I watched her go, I felt an odd mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. But most of all, I felt closure. For so long, I'd been holding on to the idea of who Tessa was, the person I thought she'd always be. But now, I saw her for who she really was. Someone who was willing to risk everything we'd built for a fleeting moment of doubt. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Tessa's shock and realization weren't my burdens to carry. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. For me, this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. The fallout began almost immediately after Tessa and I parted ways at the coffee shop. By the time I got home, I had 3 missed calls from her mother, 2 from her sister, and 1 from my own mom. Each voicemail carried the same undertone: concern, confusion, and a not-so-subtle hint of disapproval. I knew what was coming. Tessa wasn't the type to sit quietly with her emotions. She'd started spinning her narrative before I even had a chance to catch my breath. I could almost hear her voice in my head. Liam's being unreasonable. He's giving up on us. The first call I returned was to my mom. She deserved to hear it from me, not through the family grapevine. "Liam, what's going on?" she asked the moment she picked up. "Mom, Tessa and I are separating," I said, keeping my tone steady. Her sharp inhale was followed by a string of questions. "What happened? You two seemed so happy. Did you try counseling? Is this really necessary?" I took a deep breath, leaning against the kitchen counter. She wanted a break to figure out her feelings for Dylan, her ex, I explained. She walked out, and now she's realizing she made a mistake. "But it's too late, Mom. I've made my decision." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I'm sorry, Liam. I didn't see this coming." "Neither did I admitted. "But it's for the best." As supportive as she tried to be, I could hear the disappointment in her voice. It was the same disappointment I'd face from others in the days to come. Tessa's family, predictably, wasn't as measured in their responses. Her mother called me the next morning, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Liam, how could you do this to Tessa? She's heartbroken. You're throwing away your marriage over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated, barely keeping my anger in check. "She left me to explore her feelings for another man. That's not a misunderstanding, it's a choice. Her mother wasn't having it. She's trying to fix things, and you're shutting her out." I could feel my patience wearing thin. "With all due respect, Mrs. Taylor, this isn't your decision to make. Tessa made her choice, and I'm making mine." I hung up before the conversation could escalate further. The hardest part, though, was the judgment from mutual friends. Tessa had always been good at playing the victim, and she used that skill to her advantage. Social media became her stage, with vague posts about heartbreak and betrayal that painted me as the villain. One night, Noah came over with a six-pack and a sympathetic smile. "You're a trending topic in our friend group," he said, handing me a beer. "Let me guess," I replied. "I'm the bad guy." "Pretty much," he said, shrugging. "Tessa's telling everyone you blindsided her, that you're selling the house to punish her." I laughed bitterly. "Of course she is. She's always been good at making herself look like the victim." Noah gave me a look. "You could set the record straight, you know? Tell your side." I shook my head. "What's the point? Anyone who knows me will see through her. And the rest? I don't care what they think." It wasn't easy, though. The whispers, the judgmental looks, it all weighed on me. But I refused to let it derail me. I reminded myself that I wasn't responsible for managing other people's opinions. My focus was on moving forward. I did, however, decide to address the situation with my immediate family and closest friends. I invited them over one evening and laid everything out, sparing no details. "Tessa left me," I said bluntly. "She wanted to figure out if she still had feelings for her ex, and now she's realizing she made a mistake. But I'm done. I'm not going to be her backup plan." There were mixed reactions: sympathy, disbelief, even a hint of judgment from a few. But for the most part, they respected my decision. As the weeks went on, I developed a thick skin. I stopped engaging with Tessa's family and let the social fallout play out on its own. I leaned on the people who truly mattered, the ones who saw the situation for what it was and stood by me. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone, I saw yet another one of Tessa's cryptic posts. Some people don't know how to fight for love. They just give up. I chuckled to myself and blocked her. Let her wallow in her narrative. It had nothing to do with me anymore. In navigating the fallout, I learned an important lesson. You can't control what others think of you, but you can control how much power you give them. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. Work was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could focus on numbers, strategies, and deadlines. Anything but the mess my personal life had become. But Tessa, in her typical fashion, found a way to infiltrate even that. It started subtly. Colleagues began acting differently, their smiles a little too forced, their conversations cutting off when I walked into the room. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to my imagination. But then I overheard the whispers. Did you hear about Liam and Tessa? I heard he's being ruthless about the divorce. She's so sweet. How could he do that to her? My stomach twisted every time I caught snippets of gossip. Tessa was spinning her web again, painting herself as the victim and me as the cold, unfeeling husband who abandoned her. And she wasn't just stopping at our social circle. She'd somehow managed to extend her narrative to my workplace. The tipping point came during a team meeting. As my boss wrapped up his agenda, he hesitated before looking directly at me. Liam, can I see you in my office after this? The knot in my stomach tightened. Sure, I said, keeping my voice steady. When I stepped into his office later, he gestured for me to sit. Liam, I've heard some things, personal matters, that seem to be causing a bit of a stir around the office. I clenched my jaw. Of course, this was about Tessa. I'm guessing you've heard her version of events, I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. He nodded, his expression neutral. I don't want to pry, but I do need to ensure that whatever's happening doesn't affect your performance or the team's dynamic. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this wasn't his fault. Look, my personal life is just that, personal. Tessa and I are going through a separation, and she's decided to air our dirty laundry to anyone who will listen. I can assure you, it won't affect my work. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. I believe you, Liam. You've always been professional, and I trust you'll handle this situation with the same level of integrity. If you need any support, let me know. Thank you, I said, grateful for his understanding. But the conversation left a bitter taste in my mouth. Tessa's ability to manipulate people never ceased to amaze me. She knew exactly how to twist the narrative, how to make herself look like the victim while casting me as the villain. That evening, I called Noah to vent. She's dragging me through the mud, Noah. At work, no less. What kind of person does that? The kind who can't take responsibility for her own mistakes, he said bluntly. She's deflecting, trying to make you look like the bad guy so she doesn't have to face the truth. I'm sick of it, I admitted, pacing my living room. I've kept quiet, let her tell her side without challenging it, but now it's bleeding into my career. Then it's time to set the record straight, he said. Not for everyone, just the people who matter. You don't owe the world an explanation, but you deserve to protect your reputation. He was right. The next day, I took proactive steps to address the situation. I scheduled a meeting with my team, keeping it brief but direct. I'm sure some of you have heard rumors about my personal life. I began, my tone calm but firm. I want to clarify a few things. Tessa and I are separating, and while she may have her version of events, I ask that you respect my privacy. I assure you, none of this will impact my work or our team's goals. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Finally, one of my colleagues spoke up. We appreciate your honesty, Liam, and we've got your back. The words were a relief I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a foothold in a situation that had spiraled out of control. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding my professional reputation. I doubled down on my work, delivering results that spoke louder than any rumors. Slowly but surely, the whispers died down, replaced by respect for how I handled the situation. As for Tessa, I refused to engage. She could post all the vague comments she wanted, spread her version of the story to anyone who would listen. I wouldn't stoop to her level. By the time the dust settled, I'd learned another important lesson. No one can control your narrative unless you let them. And I wasn't about to let Tessa, or anyone else, define who I was. Work was my sanctuary once again, and I was determined to keep it that way. Let Tessa play her games. I had more important things to focus on, like building a life that didn't include her. It was the final jab that pushed me over the edge. Tessa had been relatively quiet for a couple of weeks, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she decided to move on. But then, out of the blue, she turned to social media. Her posts started subtly, cryptic lines like, "Some betrayals come from the people you'd least expect," and "Love doesn't just end, it gets abandoned." They were vague enough to avoid outright confrontation, but everyone who knew us understood who she was talking about. I ignored it at first. Blocking her seemed too final, and frankly, I didn't want her to think she'd rattled me. But as the days passed, her posts became more targeted. One morning, I opened my phone to see a picture of her smiling, holding a glass of wine, captioned, "Cheers to finding out who really values you." The comments were worse. Mutual friends chimed in with sympathetic messages like, "You deserve better, girl," and "Stay strong." Some people just don't appreciate what they have. It was infuriating. Here she was, rewriting the narrative for an audience who had no idea about the truth. She wasn't just twisting the knife. She was broadcasting it for the world to see. I vented to Noah that evening. "She's playing the victim again, and it's all over social media. It's like she's daring me to respond." "So don't," Noah said simply. I frowned. "What do you mean? I can't just let her get away with it." "Liam, think about it. If you engage, you're giving her exactly what she wants, a reaction. You don't need to fight her online. You're better than that." He was right, of course, but it didn't make it any easier. The injustice of it all burned inside me, a constant reminder of how far Tessa was willing to go to control the narrative. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I opened my phone and scrolled through her profile. Post after post painted her as the heartbroken heroine in some tragic love story, while I was cast as the cold, unfeeling villain. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the block button. Finally, I pressed it. Blocking her felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim a bit of control. But I didn't stop there. I went through every mutual connection, unfollowing and muting anyone who might bring her posts back into my life. The next morning, I took things a step further. I deactivated my own accounts, not permanently, just long enough to distance myself from the toxicity. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. Without the constant noise of social media, I could finally focus on what truly mattered, my own peace of mind. Tessa's last-ditch effort to manipulate the situation had backfired. Instead of drawing me into her drama, it solidified my resolve to move on. Over the next few weeks, I poured my energy into rebuilding my life. I spent more time with the people who genuinely supported me, strengthening those connections. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage, things like hiking, photography, and even cooking. Each day, I felt a little lighter, a little more like myself. Tessa's passive-aggressive jabs became a distant echo, irrelevant in the face of the progress I was making. One evening, as I sat on the patio with a cup of coffee, I reflected on everything that had happened. Tessa's social media antics had been the last straw, but they'd also been a gift. They'd forced me to confront the reality of who she was and what I wanted for my future. And for the first time, I realized that I didn't feel angry anymore. Tessa could say whatever she wanted, spin the story however she pleased. It didn't matter, because I was finally free. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Blocking her wasn't just about cutting her out of my digital life. It was about cutting her out of my mind. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than my pride. I reclaimed my peace. Waking up each morning was no longer a struggle. The air felt lighter, the silence in the house less oppressive. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't consumed by anger, frustration, or the heavy burden of betrayal. Instead, I was filled with something else, clarity. The time away from Tessa and her chaos gave me room to breathe, to think, to reflect on everything that had happened, not just over the past few months, but throughout our entire relationship. I couldn't deny that there were signs, cracks in the foundation that I'd chosen to ignore. One of the first things I did during this period of reflection was dig out an old notebook. I started writing down memories, good and bad, sifting through the timeline of our marriage like a detective piecing together clues. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. Tessa's selfishness wasn't new. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. It was in the way she made every decision about us revolve around her needs, her desires. It was in the way she dismissed my concerns or downplayed my sacrifices. It was in the way she demanded my attention but offer little in return. I'd ignored it all, chalking it up to normal relationship challenges. I told myself that compromise was part of marriage, that love meant putting the other person first. But somewhere along the way, I'd lost sight of myself. Rediscovering who I was before Tessa became my mission. I dug out my old camera and started photographing the world around me, capturing moments of beauty I'd once overlooked. I signed up for a woodworking class, something I'd always wanted to try but never found the time for. I even started reading again, devouring books that reignited my curiosity and challenged my perspective. Noah, ever the supportive friend, noticed the change almost immediately. "You seem different," he said one evening as we grabbed a drink at our favorite bar. "Different how?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Lighter," he replied, swirling his glass thoughtfully. "Like you're finally letting go of all the crap she put you through." He wasn't wrong. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was like shedding an old skin, one that no longer fit. I also spent more time with my family, reconnecting with the people who had been my foundation long before Tessa came into the picture. My mom, who had initially struggled to understand my decision, became one of my biggest cheerleaders. "I'm proud of you, Liam," she said one Sunday afternoon as we walked through the park. "I know it hasn't been easy, but you've handled this with so much grace." Her words meant more to me than I could express. For years, I'd felt like I was living for other people, for Tessa, for the image of what our marriage was supposed to be. Now, I was finally living for myself. Of course, there were still moments of doubt, fleeting thoughts of what might have been. But instead of letting those thoughts consume me, I used them as lessons. Tessa's actions had been a wake-up call, forcing me to reevaluate not just my relationship with her, but also my relationship with myself. I realized that I deserved more respect, more kindness, more reciprocity. And I vowed that moving forward, I wouldn't settle for less. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a journal in hand, I wrote down a list of all the things I wanted for my future. It wasn't about material possessions or career goals. It was about the kind of life I wanted to live, the kind of person I wanted to be. At the top of the list was a simple but powerful phrase: peace of mind. That had been the hardest thing to achieve during my marriage, and it was now the most valuable thing I owned. By the time I closed the journal, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a reminder that beauty could be found even after the darkest storms. I wasn't just healing, I was growing. Each step I took away from Tessa brought me closer to the person I was meant to be. And for that, I was grateful. As I sat there, watching the stars begin to peek through the night sky, I realized something profound. I didn't regret the marriage. It had taught me lessons I wouldn't have learned otherwise. But I also didn't regret the end of it. Because sometimes, letting go isn't just an act of moving on. It's an act of reclaiming yourself. And that, I decided, was the most powerful thing of all. Months had passed, and life had shifted in ways I couldn't have imagined. The house was sold, the divorce finalized, and Tessa was nothing more than a memory. A chapter in my life I'd closed with firm resolve. I stood in my new apartment one evening, a modern, sunlit space that reflected the person I'd become. It was smaller than the house, but it felt bigger in all the ways that mattered. The walls weren't burdened with echoes of arguments or memories of betrayal. This space was mine, and every piece of furniture, every framed photo, was chosen with intention. My days were filled with purpose again. At work, I was thriving. The fallout Tessa had tried to create had fizzled, and my colleagues saw me for who I truly was, a dedicated professional who didn't let personal struggles bleed into his career. I'd even received a promotion, which felt like the universe's way of telling me I was on the right path. Socially, I'd rebuilt my circle. Some mutual friends had drifted away, unable or unwilling to see past Tessa's narrative. But the ones who stayed were worth their weight in gold. Noah, of course, remained my anchor. His unwavering support had been a lifeline, and I made sure he knew how much I appreciated him. "You're a different guy now, Liam," he said one evening as we clinked glasses over dinner. "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You're happier, more grounded, like you've finally figured out what you want and what you don't." He was right. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. One of the biggest changes was my relationship with myself. I'd learned to enjoy my own company, to find joy in solitude. Weekends were no longer a dreaded stretch of time to fill but an opportunity to explore hobbies and passions I'd once neglected. I spent my mornings running through the park, the crisp air invigorating as I pushed my limits. I took up photography again, capturing the beauty of the world around me. Sunsets, cityscapes, candid moments of life unfolding. I even started volunteering at a local shelter, finding fulfillment in helping others rebuild their lives. Each day was a step forward, a small victory in the journey of reclaiming myself. And then, there was the unexpected joy of meeting new people. I wasn't actively looking for a relationship, but life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Her name was Emily. We met at a charity event, where she caught me staring at a photo of a rescued dog up for adoption. "Thinking about taking him home?" she asked, her voice warm and playful. I chuckled. "Not sure I'm ready for that level of commitment just yet." "Well," she said with a smile, "sometimes the things we're not ready for turn out to be the best decisions we ever make." Her words stuck with me, and as the evening went on, I found myself drawn to her kindness, her laughter, the way she seemed so genuinely present. We exchanged numbers, and while I didn't know where it would lead, I felt no pressure to rush. This time, I was determined to take things slow, to build something meaningful from a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Reflecting on everything that had happened with Tessa, I felt no bitterness, no lingering anger. Instead, I felt gratitude. Our marriage had taught me valuable lessons about love, resilience, and the importance of never losing yourself in someone else. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky, I pulled out my journal. Flipping through the pages, I smiled at the journey I'd documented. The heartbreak, the anger, the healing. It was all there, a testament to my growth. At the very end, I wrote a simple sentence. The best revenge isn't getting even, it's thriving. Because that's what I was doing. Thriving. I closed the journal and leaned back, letting the cool breeze wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt no weight on my shoulders, no ache in my chest. I had moved forward without regret, without bitterness. I was at peace, and that was worth everything. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough.